Hello there. This is Lauren Schoenberg, and I'm very happy to share this interview that I had the great honor of conducting with Mel Powell, the distinguished composer, educator, and pianist, way back on October 20th, 1983. Mr. Powell, that's what I called him when I met him, was in New York for the premiere of his 1982 string quartet. He had had dinner on October 19th with Benny Goodman. I knew about this because I was working for Goodman at the time. And I asked Mr. Powell if he would be interested in being interviewed about his early jazz days. He said yes and gave me an address to show up at. Well, it turns out he was staying with a friend in a palatial East Side apartment that actually had a maid and a butler, and tea was served and all that kind of stuff. It was a new experience for me. But you know what's funny? It seemed as though Mel Powell belonged in a place like that, because for all his modern music, he was really an avuncular, old world gentleman in many ways. You'll hear it in the great warmth and friendship in his voice during this interview. You'll also hear the poor sound quality. I had, as I mentioned, a little tape machine, but I think it makes up in quality what it's missing in audio fidelity. You know, at one point in an interview, Mel Powell talked about people showing up almost as if they lived in a time warp, wanting to talk about his old jazz days. He had lived in a very different musical world for a long time. I might have fallen into that category, but he actually seemed to relish the memories and actually getting to hear some music he hadn't heard in a very, very long time. This was 7 years before he won the Pulitzer Prize for his compositions. And he didn't wind up in New York very often, and boy, am I glad that I had the chance to spend that afternoon with him. And I'm very happy to share it with you. One small note for those who pay attention to discographies and things like that. At one point in the middle of the interview, we listened to a handful of his Goodman recordings, and although the image you'll see on the video is of the commercially issued 78 versions of those titles, some of them are actually more obscure alternate takes. That small caveat aside, let's go to Mel Powell.
Well, it's one of the first cold days of winter setting upon us here in late October 1983, and I'm sitting very lovely apartment on the east side with Mel Powell, who of course I'm sure most of the listeners are very familiar with his work, but probably haven't heard his voice too often, especially talking about his jazz career in the early days of his musical career, and that's what we're going to focus in on this afternoon's interview. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to see me. I know you're in town for, I think it's a premiere.
Yes, the string quartet is going to be done on the 21st at the Grace Randy Rogers Auditorium. It's the New York and East Coast premiere of that work.
Did you write it recently, or is it an older
yes,
work of
yours?
yours?
1982.
1982.
So it's a work of my old age, you see.
As I understand it, you've been associated with more contemporary music and electronic music. Is this a return to
I think
acoustic sounds for you?
I think that my association with electronic music is sometimes overemphasized, perhaps. Largely is because of the fact that I was the founder of the electronic music studio at Yale University, and that was very early in the game. It was at a time when I think there was probably only one other studio, the Columbia Princeton studio here in New York. So for that reason, I think my name has been, as I say, bandied about in the electronic music world. I haven't written that much electronic music, and as a matter of fact, recently, when I was in Holland, someone pointed out that far from being an electronic music composer, most of my works are for the human voice and instruments, which is a considerable distance from the oscillators and computer-generated sounds. But in any case, this is a string quartet, an honest-to-goodness string quartet, with people wearing tuxedos and things like that.
Marvelous. Well, it's hard to know where to begin to talk to you about your musical career. I know that you're from Brooklyn.
No, the Bronx.
The Bronx,
Oh,
well,
it's
they're-
very important now.
so
we
they're-
native New
right,
Yorkers have all kinds of Hatfield-McCoy feuds going between the Bronx and Brooklyn.
I'm hip.
Yes. Now, Copeland, of course, Aaron Copeland is from Brooklyn. Yes.
That's true.
Yes,
All
but
right.
you're talking to an old New York Yankee fan, and you know, how could that be Brooklyn?
Okay.
The Bronx, yeah.
Music started for you at an early age. I've read in reading about you that you actually were leading or appearing in a band at the age of 12 and 13,
Yes.
around 1935 and 1936. So obviously music got to you at an early age, and that you were tutored by such great pianists as Willie The Lion Smith, among others. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how music came into your life, and at such an early age to be performing and associated with
Well,
such great
actually, it
musicians.
was brought into my life by parents and grandparents. You know, those were the years when growing up was so different from what it is now. That is to say, there was closed society and closed family. It was sort of a nuclear family. Parents, grandparents all lived together in an apartment. In fact, I think when the family had experienced its first upward mobility, it moved down to West End Avenue. I think I still remember the address was 865 West End. My grandfather and mother and father and so on were quite musical, and they saw to it that, well, there was no question, but that the children had to be trained in music. And so at the age of 4 or 5, they managed to bring to the house a piano teacher, a German lady, I remember, named Sarah Barg. She's long since departed, and no doubt is presently enjoying the far more celestial harmony that is available to us. And so it began at the age of 4 or 5, studying the piano. Incidentally, with very rigorous, as I say, she was Germanic, and one could infer from that everything that one tends to infer. She was very rigorous, very serious pedagogue, and I knew no music other than that of perhaps Clementi and little Mozart and some two-part Bach inventions, I suppose, until I was well along, maybe 10 or 11 or something of that sort. And it was at that time that my younger brother, who is no longer alive, used to be discovered in bed with those earphones, listening to remote broadcasts. Now, he was really the jazz aficionado, and he kept saying to me, well, you must hear this stuff. And so that's really the way it began. It was, there I was, a very proper, pious little pianist preparing for a debut at Carnegie. And my young brother Lloyd who was not a performer, was not a musician, a gifted amateur, was the jazz aficionado. So that it began that way, and from there on came the classic itinerary to the Catskill Mountains in the summertime, where I met one of the most extraordinary musicians I've ever known. Alas, he's no longer alive either. His name is Heggie Barron, trumpet player and pianist and sort of Bix-Beiderbecke tradition fellow. And he is the one who introduced me to virtually everything and everyone in jazz, including Willie The Lion Smith.
Right.
And those happy, halcyon days, I would get on the subway, go on up to Harlem, meet Willie, bring him a bottle of sherry, and we'd spend hours at the piano, and he would be barking, doing all the things that got him to be called the Lion, and especially was emphatic about being a two-handed piano player. That was very important to Willie the Lion. You know, he didn't care much for these one-handed tinklers, as he called them.
Sure. Was all this going on while you were still in public school, I guess? So
I was still in public school.
You were up late at night, I guess.
High school, yes. And I guess I must have had a little less sleep in those days than I like to have these days.
So it started by listening to radio broadcasts and then meeting this gentleman you referred to, and he, I guess, took you around to hear the different bands.
In fact, he took me to a club which later I performed at, but at that time was one of the most illustrious, legendary places called Nick's in Greenwich Village. His name, as I say, his name was Heggie, and Heggie was was a man who lived by the gospel. That is the real thing. He would not permit me to be dissuaded by what might on the surface seem like jazz. He would not stand for that. It had to be the real thing.
Did that include most of the big bands of that era were not the real thing?
He was very selective.
Right.
Yes, most of the big bands of that era were not to Heggie, the real thing. And I dare say probably, I wasn't competent to judge, but I had boundless faith in his judgment.
So what bands would he include? Duke and
he would allow
Benny, maybe?
He would allow Duke. He would allow Basie, who was not well known at the time. And he would give Benny the benefit of the doubt, let's say, since he always felt, actually subsequently I think I had a different view, but he always felt that Benny's band was the most precise and musicianly of the bands. They were neat, they were playing, they'd always play in tune and so on and so forth, but that some part of the roughness of the Chicago style and the down New Orleans style and Kansas City style was missing from the white bands. Heggie himself was white, but he had a very deep fervor for the gospel.
All right. So as a pianist, it started with lessons with Willie The Lion Smith. Although by this time, I assume this is the mid-1930s, Teddy Wilson was on the horizon, and Earl Hines had done his thing. Where was your playing at this stage? Were you emulating Willie The Lion Smith, or had you also had an ear open to the more contemporary
I think I was
developments?
imitating. Incidentally, at the time, I was studying still with Sarah Barg, and then later with Nadia Eisenberg. In those days, one didn't carry the sort of aesthetic baggage we're stuck with now. I didn't know the difference. All I knew was pianism and music and so on. And I really didn't know the difference between what today I suppose we characterize as high art, low art, pop art, middle class, higher middle, etc., etc. None of those categories were really certainly not in my consciousness. I don't think that anyone else's at the time, nor would they be at that age. So I was studying still. As a matter of fact, I remember the first time when my jazz interests began to spill over. I was playing some Chopin for my teacher, and there must have been a passage that was difficult to execute, so I suppose I changed it. And that seemed to me perfectly legitimate. You see, on the other, when I'd be with Willie The Lion Smith, I could do anything I wished so far as improvising was concerned. And I remember Miss Bogg reaching for a ruler. She was very small, so she had to have aids, and walloped me on the hand. And I thought, well, what in the world happened? And she said, that's not what's written. And I said, yes, I know, it's better. What's written, of course, she couldn't understand. So the truth is, though, I think I was imitating, certainly Willie the Lion, very much conscious of Fats Waller and so on. But when my brother took me to the Paramount Theater for the first engagement, 1936 or something like that, when Benny Goodman's band was playing then, Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson and Gene Krupa and that group. And I still remember this because we stayed, I even remember that Claudette Colbert was in the movie because we stayed for who knows how many shows, at that point I could have memorized the script of the movie. We had to see it 4 times to stay in our seats to see the band, which was then the stage show. I was absolutely stunned. It was the first time I had ever heard, I guess, really marvelous big band jazz, and it was the first time I had heard Teddy Wilson. And I thought that I can almost bring up the memory now. It was one of the loveliest musical experiences ever to hear that man play the piano, as he did, especially in those days. I think he played only in the trio. I think Stacy was playing the band in the trio and quartet and so on. So that became the man I imitated. And then, I would meet people like Mesro, that's a famous name of jazz, and he would say, well, why are you doing that? Why don't you go to the source? And I said, well, what's the source? He said, well, Earl Hines, etc. So, you would pick up your information this way and go and seek records, and or if you could get some, after all, I was a little young for running around jazz clubs, so if I could get someone to take me, usually Heggie, who was older, if ever pianists played. So I would say that I staggered around rather innocently. I had no idea that Teddy had come after Earl or anything of that sort. Nor did I know that Teddy had come after Tatum and admired Tatum. So all that gradually came into my ken. And I think that that the pianists from that time to the time I became a sort of full-fledged professional jazz pianist myself, I'd say the pianists who most directly influenced me and whom I admired most were, in no special order, I'd say Hines and Fatzwaller and Tatum and of course Teddy.
Right.
And I think that I very consciously and very deliberately tried to play as elegantly and as beautiful as Teddy Wilson. I don't think I was ever successful in achieving that.
That's open to some conjecture. But one thing that's easy to see is how you would be drawn to Willie the Lion and then to Teddy, because you can detect some Chopin-esque or things in some of Willie the Lion's compositions, and then also in Teddy. I think it's hard to make judgments when it comes to technique and things like that, but Teddy certainly had the most finesse and elegant touch in a classical sense that had been brought to jazz outside of maybe Tatum, who really some people feel wasn't fully developed at that time, although I wasn't there, and that's just a matter of guesswork.
Well, Tatum had the most staggering kind of virtuosity.
When did you first hear Tatum in person? At the same time, or was it later?
It was, I started to chuckle, Lauren, because I remember it very clearly. It was one of those strange, devastating moments in a young musician's life when I was working then sort of illegally. I think I was too young to join the union or something. And who do you think hired me? Well, yes, Nick hired me to be sort of fill-in pianist.
Nick
Ronchetti, who owned Nick's, and who was a piano buff. He just adored the piano. He loved to play a little bit himself and so on. And he had two. I think he hired two pianists, and the other one was Nat King Cole, who later became. But who was a very good pianist, an Earl Hines kind of pianist, by the way. Not too many people knew that when he made his career as a famous singer. And so I was one of the pianists on the floor, and I think they used to hide me in the men's room when the union delegate came around or something of that sort. And then I would sit in with Sidney Bechet, and he took a liking to me. He introduced me to drinking gin. I thought it was water because of the color of it. And of course, I was ill for several weeks. But when I came back to work, I was standing around one day, and in came this man. I mean, one evening, waiting for my turn to play after Nat played, King Cole played. There came this gentleman, and there was a good fuss made about him. And he was that famous pianist from Cleveland. And he sat down at the piano and played. It was Tatum. And it was my task, of course, to follow him. That's why I started to laugh when you asked about the first time I heard him in person. I did not laugh at the time. The idea of going over to the piano and then playing solo piano. He played solo. Now, my job was to play solo as well. Happily, of course, Willie the Lion had trained me to be a two-handed piano player, because with Tatum, one had the impression he was listening to eight hands, So I went to the piano terribly unhappy, very reluctant. I sort of looked at Nick to say, well, could we just skip this set? This seems to be the wrong moment. But no, I had to take my punishment, and so I went and played after Tatum. He sat near the piano, which didn't help matters either. And then he grunted something at me later, which I've always treasured. He said, how old are you? And I told him I was 15 and a half or 16 or something. He said, you're going to be one of the real ones. I thought that was so lovely to hear from that that master. That was the first time I heard Tatum.
I see. When did the influence of Tatum make itself known in your playing? In other words, when I listened to your work with Benny, let's say in 41 and 42, and then when you came back after being with Glenn Miller's Army Air Force, in 45, of course, you have a very distinctive style coming out of Teddy Wilson, but yet, of course, it's obvious it's Mel Powell. Then later on in some of those records you made for Vanguard, and those trio records like I have on the tape here, we'll hear later a little introduction you played on You're My Thrill. That seems to me to be coming from an influence from a number of places, including possibly Tatum, and I wonder if you feel that it took you a while to absorb the Tatum influence, or was his influence a technical one on you?
No, I think it was always there, but there are different requirements, even today probably, for playing with a small band, playing with a big band, and playing soloistically. And Tatum, of course, is the ideal soloistic pianist. I think almost all pianists who play either pop music or jazz could do no better than to simulate Tatum's coverage, his pianism, his coverage of the instrument. So I think it was more a matter of the opportunities for that. Don't forget that nearly my entire career as a jazz pianist was as pianist with big band and or the trio in Benny's case, in a trio and quartet and so on.
Sextet too.
And sextet, right. And those are not really the ideal forums for that enormous idiosyncratic, eccentric, or almost egomaniacal statement that Tatum makes so well at the piano. I think it was more that, and then of course the Vanguard records opened up opportunity to do that. But in a certain sense, I'm saying that I was eclectic. I would adjust to, but I think a good player should do that in any case. I would adjust to whatever the requirements were. You know, if you know yourself, you were telling me about a big band that you have rehearsing, reading things. Well, you know, if the pianist were to be Tatum, jazz should be more in the way.
Sure, of course.
Of a big band. So I think it was more that.
I see. All right. Well, let's take it back to Nick's. So you're playing at Nick's and playing opposite people like Nat Cole and Willie The Lion Smith. One thing I'd like to ask you about that phase in your career. From what I can understand, there was like a fraternity of pianists, and there were what they call cutting sessions, and times when guys would get together at after-hours clubs, and one would play after another and show each other little tricks, or sometimes they wouldn't show, and you'd have to go home and try and figure it out. And I'm wondering if you have any memories of get-togethers like that, and your feelings about some of the other pianists like Billy Kyle and Jess Stacy, and specific reminiscences or influences that they had on you.
I know the sessions you're talking about. I don't recall really being much of a participant in those. Many of the ones which I knew about actually used to take place uptown in Harlem, between sort of monster pianists like Willie the Lion and Fats Waller and Tatum and some others. But I think you're right that it's a paradox. On the one hand, it was highly competitive, and there would be so-called cutting contests, you know, who played faster, louder, more interesting harmonies, and so on, as a better improvisation. On the other hand, you're exactly right. At the same time, it was fraternity, and I do recall the ease with which we would approach one another and see what was that thing you see. We'd know the records very well, or if just it happened in person, say, what was the thing you were doing? What was that? And really, someone would sit and show you specifically what it was. And sometimes even I was asked by some others, what was that about? How do you do that? Sure. And I'd show and say, oh yeah, that's easy. You know, that sort of thing. You mentioned Jess Stacy and you mentioned Billy Kyle, both of whom I admired very, very, very much. And I have a suspicion that everyone one admires, probably to some degree, has influence on your own playing. I don't know how it comes through, how it's filtered through, but certainly I adored Stacy, and Stacy used to come down and mix a lot, and occasionally Billy Kyle would be there. There's another pianist, very well known, was Joey Bushkin. And I think we were all very good friends. we admired one another, and we probably did not feel so much that it was a matter of personal property, things that we might do, or styles, or so on, but more, as Thornton Wilder once said about players, it was more a relay race. And we were very happy to hand over.
Right. Let me run some names of pianists by, and if it's not putting you on the spot too much, maybe you can just give your impressions of them and their strong points or things that you enjoyed about them or anything. Let's start with Nat Cole, and maybe you could verbalize some of your feelings about his particular approach to the piano at that time.
I thought that Nat was one of the very best of the Earl Hines influenced pianists. Now, in those days, that meant, of course, some strong octave playing, some very strange rhythmic things with the left hand, rather than the steadiness of the tenths, let's say, that Teddy would feature. So I think they used to, well, even before that time when the Earl was playing, I think they were talking about it being a trumpet style on the keyboard, and converting the trumpet playing of Louis to octave stuff on the keyboard. And I'd say that Nat King Cole was really one of the very best doing that. I always thought he was going to, now of course we're talking about when he was very young and he had a little trio with Teddy Bunn and so on. I always thought he was going to be one of the top jazz pianists, and I couldn't have been more amazed to find him singing all those mellow, nice, negotiable tunes.
Luckily enough, though, he did have the chance to make some classic recordings. Have you ever heard the ones he made with Lester Young in a trio format?
No, but I'll bet they're first class.
They're marvelous. He does some rhythmic things, polyrhythmic kind of things, really kind of unique. And again, there's an example of what you're talking about, a pianist playing differently without a guitar and a bass when they're just playing with a drummer, because you're much more free to change the harmonic rhythm and things. You can't do that when you're playing with a guitar and a bass. All right. How about Billy Kyle? Was he another one of the Earl Hines
I think
disciples?
he was, yes, and he had a wonderful dynamism and an excitement in his playing. Somehow, I think it must have had to do with the way he attacked the actual touch, the way he attacked the keys. My recollection is of first of all a wonderful imagination. The notes he'd pick and so on. But more than that, it was the dynamism of that attack. Everything was exciting. He could not play a dreary measure. Everything was exciting. That was my impression. Is that the way you sort of recall it? He bounced off just sort of percussively. It was a good sound, but a percussive sound. And especially the way he would do those Earl Hines like digs in the left hand always made me laugh. They were a very joyous player.
Sure. How about someone, now this is going back, I don't even know if you ever heard him or saw him, but I'm going to take a chance. Arthur Schutt. Or was that someone that was before your time?
That's only a name I knew.
Only a name.
I knew as a name, coming, I thought, from sort of the Paul Whiteman days or something like that. I don't know, he played with Whiteman, but that was really just a little too early for me to have known.
Donald Lambert.
Again, it's a name.
A name.
Yes, but a very well thought of name, very highly respected name.
I see.
Yes, but I did not know.
What?
You know the name Art Hodes?
Art Hodes, of course.
See, well, now, Art Hodes was, of course, he's younger than these you're talking about, I suppose. But he was about as early as I really got to hear someone who played in a comparatively much older style, and without a great deal of facility.
Right.
And so, thanks to Heggie's training of me, I could detect the real stuff.
How did Count Basie strike you when you first heard him in New York with his band? Were you aware of the fact that he had been a marvelous stride player before?
No, I wasn't. I learned about that later, and I just kind of got to know the Count, and I think we retained a friendship over 40 years or so. No, I didn't. I had no indication of that. Even recently, whenever you hear the Count play stride, it's so authentic and it's so good. I really thought, I guess the word is nifty. I just thought that was nifty what he was doing.
Right.
The planks and plunks, and with that beautifully timed moment, and of course his rhythmic sense was absolutely extraordinary. He could do no wrong. So I admired it. In one sense. On the other hand, it was a sort of pianism that I guess I'd been prejudiced against. The one hand playing,
Right. Sure.
Sort of thing. After all, I came from the school of Tatum and Wilson and Earl Hines and Fats Waller to some degree. Now, when I would mimic Fats, I remember once doing it in the living room, someone like this, but Count was there, and he just rolled on the floor. He absolutely adored it. And then he would get up and do two-hand piano as well. But I think in all candor, I was not an admirer of the pianism
Right.
as much as of the taste and the elegance with which he did that tiny thing that he did.
Right. How about a pianist who you were a contemporary of? I believe, in fact, he played with Benny for a brief spell right before you did. Ken Kersey.
Oh, I remember.
Kenny Kersey.
Yeah, I thought he was very good.
Yeah.
That was a very good player. Also, I thought sort of same school, same influences, Hines, and Tatum. Very good player.
At this time, we're talking the late 1930s, early 1940s. Were you aware of a movement in jazz piano? I mean, as differentiating between the styles, you could say Basie and Teddy, kind of, let's say, in the vanguard of things, and people like possibly Earl Hines and Joe Sullivan and people like that belonging to a different school. And were you attracted to music that was a little more progressive or adventurous, or weren't you thinking about that?
No, I think I was aware of that. I loved what, from my point of view, was the tradition. I loved hearing guys play like Joe Sullivan, essentially Art Hodes, even to some degree Stacy. Now you see, with Stacy and Hodes, you had a sort of what I took to be a real insight into the Chicago style of playing. And it was not a technically astute or adept. These were not big virtuoso pianists in the sense, let's say, that Teddy was, or that Tatum was. But my tastes, given the age and so on and so forth, my tastes were much more, I was quite conscious of the difference in musical generations, whether they were chronological or not, but certainly in musical generations. And even though I grew up playing with Eddie Condon and I don't mean at Eddie Condon's, I mean with Eddie Condon.
Oh yeah, where?
And down at Nick's.
At Nick's?
Bobby Hackett, Brad Gowans.
Bud Freeman.
Bud Freeman, whom I always adored. He was a master. Despite that, my tastes were a little bit more, I guess, shaped very much by Teddy. A certain kind of elegance and reticence.
And also his sound and tone.
The sound and tone and the real, the son choisi, that chosen notes and chosen sound, so carefully done and yet improvised. So I think my answer to your question could have been very brief, but yes, I was aware of.
Talk as much as you want, please. We have a long time. Of course, our guest is, as they called him back in his jazz days, Mel Powell, and now a very distinguished educator, composer on the West Coast, who is visiting New York and was kind enough to give us some time on a lovely Thursday afternoon to talk to him about the old days. And again, thanks for taking your time. Of course, we've talked quite a bit about pianists, and in terms of your career, we haven't even gotten you with Benny Goodman yet, and I would love to find out how John Hammond and different people entered the picture. But you also must have had your other ear, figuratively speaking, tuned towards arrangements, because of course at a very early age you were producing arrangements and very, I don't want to say complicated, but very intricate arrangements. So when did you begin to study arrangements, and who were your influences on that aspect? Fletcher Henderson or Duke, or where did your inspiration come in terms of arranging?
I really did not study arranging. I had already begun training as a so-called serious composer. But when I joined Benny's band, really that was the beginning of it. There was, and of course now looking back, one thinks of the kind of chutzpah is the right word, arrogance one has. I simply looked around, and Benny asked me, would I write this for the band, would I write that for the band, and I said, certainly. A couple of trombones and trumpets saxophones, and so I think it really was. There's really not much of a story there.
Well, I'm just interested in the.
So far as those went, I adored everyone. I loved the way Duke wrote. I loved the way Fletcher Anderson wrote for Benny's band. I thought this was marvelous in taste. Then somewhat later, with Eddie Sauter, I admired very much.
But in terms of voicing and just the actual part of just sitting down with a score and scoring things out and composing. Of course, you were composing when you were improvising, but it's a different thing when you write an arrangement. And coming out with the Earl at that age, I just wonder, I mean, was the Earl actually one of the first times you just sat down and wrote an arrangement? Or hadn't you had trial and error?
No, I think I did. I think I did some. I don't know what the first one was. I think maybe it was Jersey Bounce, or I don't know. Some,
the Earl really
comes later.
The Earl really shows up as one of the very earliest. Right after you joined the band.
Well, that. I know what I think. I think this is accurate. I think Benny asked me to write a piece featuring myself as pianist, to do a piece for the band. They didn't have anything in the book, and which after all was very generous. Benny normally was going to play everything from beginning to end, but we don't forget we played theaters and shows and things of that sort where one would show off the various players in the band, and he asked for a piece. That's how that came about. I chose to do the Earl as a tribute to Earl Hines, but I don't recall it as having posed a problem at all. Probably because, as I say, I had been trained. I had been studying composition for some time. You see, yes.
Privately or at
privately, I'd been with Bernard Wagner, who was at Juilliard, and others. So I had been fairly well trained. It did not. It was not a technical hurdle. Let's say. Let's put it that way. I think, and of course, there was one thing I do recall now, almost nostalgically and longingly. I knew everyone in the band, so I didn't write for first trombone. I wrote for Lou.
Right.
You see what I mean? I knew exactly what everyone did,
right.
And it seemed very normal and natural to me. I knew exactly, obviously, the way Benny would sound,
right.
And whoever the other players were, the first trumpet player, if it was Butterfield or Zeke Sargent or whoever it was, I knew exactly what the sonority was.
Right.
And of course, minimal instructions. I'd write the notes. I wouldn't write piano or forte or accent or no accent or so. I was really writing what they played. That's something I say, one doesn't fully appreciate when one's doing that, because much later it isn't the case. One writes a wind quintet, and it's a wind quintet, and then it might be all kinds of ways of decoding the notation. But that I always remember with pleasure.
All right, so we've got you with Nick's in the late 1930s, and how did it come about that Benny Goodman became aware of you and your step up the ladder to when you were the pianist in the #1 commercially popular swing band in the country?
By a strange coincidence, we were talking about it last night.
Oh, with Benny, that's right.
Dinner,
you were with Benny Goodman.
Yes, and we were reminiscing about that. And Benny tells the story, and I recall it about the same way. I was playing at Nick's, and Benny had come down to Nick's, I think, at the urging of George Simon. Now, do you know that name, George Simon?
I play with George yesterday. He has a jam session at Eddie Condon's every Wednesday afternoon.
Well,
and they have jam sessions.
Please give him my love.
Oh, tell him I saw
Give him my love. It was George who had heard me at Nick's, and I think he brought Benny down there, or both probably. Sort of with it, I came uptown. I guess someone was leaving Benny's band. I don't remember who. It might have been Johnny Grenier.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so George Simon said, Benny, you must hear this young fellow. And I played for Benny. And as Benny tells the story, he turned to his secretary. Now, I don't know if it was Muriel. I don't think so. I think it was pre-Muriel days. She might not even have been born then, for all I know. He turned to Muriel and said, he was chuckling when he was telling this story yesterday, and he said, what do you think of this fellow? Does he play pretty well? And the secretary said, yeah. And so he said, okay, let's hire him. And it might very well have been that way, yes. Now, of course, in a funny sense, I was telling this also, it was so odd. Now, here was Benny, he was, the Titan. He was like, I don't know, like the Beatles were later, so famous and King of the Hill, as well as King of Swing and so on. And I was torn in a funny way, because although the opportunity to join that band and to play where only a year or two earlier I had been collecting autographs from Teddy Wilson and so on, to sit in those chairs where Teddy and Jess Stacy had been, was a great opportunity. On the other hand, I had this conflict because of Heggie. You see, this was not the pure. I had been with Bechet and with Brad Gowans, George Wetling, and Zooty Singleton playing down in the Village. So it was funny. It was mixed, but of course the attractions of fame and notoriety and immortality were too great to resist. So that was actually the way it happened. It was an audition for the job. Benny sitting there. I still recall that.
How did you?
Yeah.
Looking at it now, how do you compare the two musical experiences outside of the fact that you're playing in the Waldorf Astoria with Benny and you're playing at a very nice saloon down in the Village with Bechet and Brad Gowans and Bud Freeman, people like that? How do you, in your mind now, weigh the two different musical experiences as equal ones of just a different nature, or as different at a very substantial degree?
I think they're very different, but in all seriousness, they cannot be judged by me as better or worse or anything of that sort, higher or lower level. I was one of those players who, despite being a soloistic player and so on, I loved playing in a big band when the big band was swinging. I thought there's nothing like that on earth. I still think so, by the way. The sound of a great jazz band, big jazz band, is something so extraordinary. There's nothing like it. It is indeed, in every possible sense, unique. So I was one who I loved that. I might be sitting doing nothing but what do they used to call comping play. I would just be doing nothing, listen to this incredible band playing. It sounded marvelous. So that had that virtue. Now, on the other hand, other side of the coin, down there in the Village, when playing in the small club and playing the real thing, every moment and every player is laden with imagination and invention and improvisation at a level that far transcends what the individuals in the big band, with the exception of, obviously, a few illustrious soloists themselves, far beyond that level. That's occurring at every moment down there. So you see that it's two different planes.
Sure.
And it seems.
And you could have changed the direction if you were playing piano in a small group. You could hit one chord or one note and change the direction of the whole performance, whereas, of course, in a big band, unless you went up and stood on top of the piano, it wouldn't...
Yeah, right. It would not affect.
It wouldn't affect it that much.
It's very much like string players and their desire to play chamber music. If they're playing in the orchestra, New York Philharmonic or so, you always find those guys, except for the concertmaster, let's say, but you find those guys in the third and fourth desks, they're reading the racing form or something. Right. They'd rather, because they don't feel they hear themselves, they're being duplicated by some 60 other fiddle players and so on. It's very similar to that, of course. But if it's a great band or it's a great orchestra, it's delicious because you're making music and you're making wonderful music. So that's why I can't really compare them and say this is better than that. So two utterly different experiences.
But you did find fulfillment in subjugating your ego to playing in a big band, whereas many people, I think, didn't.
No, I think many people were incapable of doing that.
And one of the people you mentioned, I think, was probably, that was one of his strongest virtues, was Jess Stacy. And because you could hear him through the whole band, he'd be sitting there and making his little comments.
He was probably I suppose, the most underappreciated pianist in the entire jazz world. I think. I mean, a lot of people understood, but a lot didn't. They didn't realize how beautifully he propelled the band often, and how he was there in the most subtle way. I thought, I loved what he played. In fact, again, I tried to mimic what Jess did in the band sometimes, but I think I was a little too exuberant.
All right, I think we'll listen to a little more music of when you first joined the band. We're going to hear you and the Benny Goodman Trio along with Big Sid and Benny in a trio performance on Ida, a performance that
Wow.
isn't available, and we have some other surprises for
Wow,
you
I
and the
can't
listeners.
wait. I want to hear it.
Okay. it's obvious you got a kick out of hearing those things.
The interview may be over. I'm speechless. just knocked out.
What are just some
Trio.
of the very first impressions or things that come back to you after hearing that?
Well, one of the thoughts that came to mind was that, in fact, if there was anything I really did enjoy better than anything, it was playing in the trio. I thought of that immediately as what pleasure that was, and I suspect there are a few reasons for it. It again has to do with that business of the left hand piano playing, the fact that there was not a bassist or guitarist to have to coordinate with, so that I could be free with that. So I guess that's like the fiddle player wanting to hear himself and wanting to be free in chamber music, which of course that is in jazz. I loved that. I think Benny played at his best there as well. And of course the third member of that particular trio was, in my opinion, one of the real giants of jazz and certainly of drumming. It was Big Sid Catlett. I was seeing him as I was listening to the trio. There's a man who, he's monstrous. I mean, the big was not irony. He really was Big Sid. He must have weighed about 300 pounds or so. Great big man with probably the most sensitive touch of any drummer I've ever known. He could do all the driving things, but he had a sense of pitch, actually. And remember, this was before rototoms and bongos and things that were. He played really the basic drum set, the traps, I think, is what they're called technically. Right. But with a wonderful, wonderful touch, wonderful sense, actually, of pitch, different places to strike the thing. And I suppose he could do what really only the very great people can do, and that is to be restrained, to hold back and dynamics, and have the greatest kind of fervent excitement cooking all the time. He was a great joy to play with. And then, of course, I heard after that the I'm Here,
right,
and that brought back some memories. If you will forgive what clearly has to be immodesty, it sounded marvelous to me. I haven't heard it in 35, 40 years. It really did sound wonderful. And I think I got a lot of pleasure from that. That was sort of a commission in a way, although we didn't speak of commissions in those days in that domain. But there was a radio broadcast, a commercial that Benny was doing, and I think one of the writers had given Benny the line, "I'm here." Or that was the origin of the title, and so we decided to do a new piece about it. Anyway, this stuff has knocked me out. I'm beginning to understand why it was that Benny was as popular as he was. Actually, it seems to me to hold up very, very well. Here and there, you'll hear a few things that are clearly very dated, but in general, the way it boils and swings, that's sort of a timeless kind of quality, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's why we devote so much time to studying it, because you could really take most of the music of that era, as of any era, and put it in one box or one category, and then you can take the music that remains and really seems to step outside of its particular time period, that you can listen to now. And even though, as you mentioned, a lot of people, when they listen to music, they're more involved in the equipment they're listening to it on. But
yes.
If you're really enjoying the music, you can listen to an old recording of Giesa King or an old recording of Tatum or of you or of Benny Goodman. Regardless of the sound quality, it's the music that comes out of the speakers.
Yes, hi-fi and low music is very poor, it seems to me. I'd much rather have high music and low fidelity.
Speaking of fidelity, we're going to switch the tape over and listen to a little bit more music, and we'll be back. Again, our guest, and a very, unfortunately, infrequent stay in New York, Mel Powell. And you're listening to Out to Lunch, is the name of my show, on WKCR FM 89.9. This is your Out to Lunch host, Lauren Schoenberg.
plenty money, 1922. You let other women make a fool of you. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. You're sitting down wondering what it's all about. You ain't got no money, they will put you out. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. If you had prepared 20 years ago, you wouldn't be a wandering now from door to door. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. I fell for your jiving and I took you in. Now all you got to offer me is a drink of gin. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Like some other men do.
just heard many of the compositions, in some cases, well, your composition and arrangements of many great tunes for the Benny Goodman Band. It must have been quite a thrill to hear your own pieces played and then get to play on them. I've always felt that when a pianist is the person who wrote the chart, it's very special to hear you play like on String of Pearls or on those charts, because you knew exactly what you were setting up and everything.
Yes, you do have a bit of an advantage, since you can predict everything, every open spot. You know how to sneak in, of course.
This band of Benny's had really a different character than the one before. The band playing the Edgar Sampson, Fletcher Henderson, and Spud Murphy arrangements, the 37, 38 band. I'm wondering if you could characterize.
What year is this?
These are that was 1942, and
42.
All the other ones were 1941.
Well, he's of course even given the title, based on the title of the ambassador,
Right.
Joseph Davies, who written the book Mission to Moscow. Of course, 1942.
Mission to Moscow. And before that, we heard of the sextet with Limehouse Blues and the quartet with You and I, and also String of Pearls, which was quite a switch, because I think it was Glenn Miller had a big hit with
Yes,
this. And then,
that was Miller's big record, yes.
And then your arrangement came out, which was really a much more interesting one. Of course, you were arranging for the band. Benny had I think Jimmy Monday was still producing occasional scores, but of course, I guess the big news of that band, the big change, was the music of Eddie Sauter.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you can tell us some of your thoughts about Eddie's writing for the band and how it struck you at that time, at that point of time.
Well, probably Eddie was the first writer for Benny's band, and possibly for any of the popular bands or swing bands, who brought to the writing a kind of a technical finesse with voice leadings, and even inventing tone colors out of, after all, a fairly limited palette, brass and saxophones. I think he was the first to bring to that task very elegant and far-reaching views that he probably developed as at Juilliard, which is where he studied, from a keen knowledge of what were then very advanced contemporary scores and serious music. Eddie was very learned at the time, and somewhat alone in that, so far as the writers for swing bands were concerned. So I think probably Eddie Sauter was more responsible than virtually anyone for the change. It's slight. I mean, the band is still swinging and so on, but there is a change toward a certain modernity, a certain kind of complexity that actually always used to be left to Duke Ellington when it came to the swing music. The swing band. Duke's band was the advanced harmonic band and so on. And I think Eddie brought that influence to Benny Goodman's band. And I probably myself must have mimicked some of it in some of the things that I was doing. But I think he was really a wondrous inventor. And what's interesting about Eddie was that he was not a composer. Of course, he did compose a few pieces, and some wonderful pieces for Benny. I remember particularly Superman that he did for Cootie Williams, and I think Clarinet a la King for Benny. Wonderful pieces. But that was not what I don't even think Eddie himself was terribly interested in. It. He was a born arranger. Can you imagine being born to arranging? So my recollection is that especially the first rehearsals, they were always so fascinating, because Benny, in a certain sense, was confronting a music far more elaborate, say, than the Fletcher Henderson choice. Now, again, when I say elaborate, I'm not making judgmental thing, meaning better or worse or anything like that, but just significantly different from the Fletcher Henderson scores. And it was always interesting how, let's say, comparatively difficult it was to put them together. I mean, these were the times when the band really would rehearse to find the right notes, the notes that Eddie had written, They didn't necessarily lay just under the fingers as some of the earlier scores had. Yes, there was a different time, and I can still, even from this distance, I remember first rehearsals of things like Intermezzo, and I think a piece called More Than You Know, and some other things that he'd write. They were always fascinating, always interesting, always, by the way, a little bit more contrapuntal than other people would write. There were interesting things to be played with inside voices. So I suspect that the musicians in the band, the horn players, saxophone and brass players, I imagine they must have enjoyed playing Sauter's arrangements very much. I'm not so sure that Benny always shared their enjoyment, because there were complexities
Sure.
that Benny, with his very fine sense of direct, simple assertion, would sometimes actually balk at, and say, "Oh, Eddie, leave that out," or "Can the saxophones be tacit here?" or something of that sort. There was a lot of that going on. But I think all of Sauter's contribution played the major part in that distinction between the band at that time, in the early 40s, and the earlier band. Don't you think so? It seems to me that it was Eddie largely being responsible for that.
We did a show on Eddie Sauter several months ago, and I had as a guest John Carisi.
I remember Johnny very well.
Arranger, and he told me that he was pals with Sauter at this time too. And at that point, he said Eddie Sauter was very deeply into the music of Prokofiev.
Yes.
And actually, when you think about some of those brass sonorities and some of the different things, you can actually hear it.
Yes, that's what I meant when I said that Eddie was very astute and busy studying the scores of Prokofiev and Stravinsky, and others who at the time, of course, were writing at what was thought to be the cutting edge of the so-called avant-garde.
Yes. As long as we're talking about people at that time who were in the cutting edge of the avant-garde, among the instrumentalists of the era, outside of pianists who, of course, could put their harmonic knowledge, and as we heard you on Limehouse Blues, incorporating whole tone effects, and in your arrangements, different changes of keys.
I was surprised at one point it sounded like early Monk.
Yes, oh sure. Yes. I'd like to talk about some of the instrumentalists, or some of the horn players, who at that time were in the vanguard or playing new ideas, and how musicians were aware that something different was going on. Charlie Christian, Jimmy Blanton, Lester Young, those three in particular, and Roy Eldridge are people that people in retrospect can point to and say they were playing either longer lines or implicating different harmonic things. Were you aware of, let's say, those four individuals at that time, and did you separate them from the other players? Lester, Charlie,
Yes.
Blanton, let's say Roy.
Each one that you mentioned was singular. That was a special case. I was very much aware of them, and a great admirer. I didn't know at the time I'm not sure I know now, but I certainly did not know at the time just what the differentiation was. It was clear that there was something else that they were doing that other instrumentalists, including myself, were not doing. I think I do have a better view of it now, especially in the light of what I think it led to.
Right.
In each case, well, as I say, each was singular. Now, with Blanton and with Eldridge, one was really coming upon a kind of technical command that was extraordinary at the time. When there were some records, I guess, I don't even remember the name, but there'd be some records that Blanton would make with Duke,
Right.
where one heard the bass played in ways that never been played. Again, Eldridge's kind of command of sheer speed, for that matter, the number of notes per second, was startling. Because while they'd been wonderful trumpet player, of course, Louis early in life, the West End blues and things, that's other classics.
And Jabbo Smith and Red
Jabbo
Allen.
Smith, Red Allen got around the horn and so on. Eldridge had, it seemed to me, a special degree of virtuosity. Plus, that question, which I suppose has more to do with the rhythmic domain than anything else, long line playing, and the beginnings of a kind of harmonic exploration that obviously, let's say, would set them far apart from, let's say, Lou and Garrity. Right. Lou was playing tonic and the dominant, playing
blues kind of,
bluesy kind of playing. Yes, the minor third and the minor seventh and so on. I mean, but straight down the line, as it were, a notch away from Dixieland or Chicago playing. McGarity was playing, and I thought superbly. A heavy, clear enunciation of beats and so on. What they were doing was something obviously far removed from that. Now, Les Young, Prez was playing a smoothness, a velvety kind of playing, and also I thought a suggestive, nuanceful kind of playing that was far more inside. You'd have to go to Lester. He wouldn't come to you, as it were, in his playing. A sound, of course, that I thought was pure velvet. It just couldn't sound better. Demure, intimate, and strings of notes that weren't quite the way the strings of notes had been played by people like myself and Benny. And so on and so forth. I was very concerned, of course, with Charlie Christian, talking about really an incredible kind of inventive genius.
And you actually had the chance to play in the band with him for a few moments there.
Yeah, Charlie and I, we got to be pretty good friends. Well, of course, he died very shortly after that.
What happened? He left the band. He was sick. Was that it?
Charlie was plagued by, I suppose, every sort of wretched thing. I know he had tuberculosis, and my recollection is Charlie did not really take very good care of himself. He probably had much more to drink than anyone should, and various other accoutrements, I suppose. I remember I took Charlie down to the draft board by the Armory here in town when he had his letter of greeting from the president, and Charlie was examined by the Army physician. I remember a very, very funny moment. I knew that Charlie was very sick, and as I say, in addition to tuberculosis, which was ravaging his body, there were several other very serious illnesses. And I recall the doctor saying, "Well, Mr. Christian, is there any reason why you should not be inducted into the United States Army? Is there any medical problem that you might have?" And Charlie thought for a moment, absolute straight face, I fell to the floor, and he said, "Well, I wear eyeglasses." I remember that with affection. Sure. As you know the history of it. Of course, he was not inducted, and then shortly thereafter he died. But this was a great, great player, and I suspect that from Eldridge, Blanton, Christian, and Les Young, there must have come the seeds of the very next great movement, the bop movement, with Dizzy and Charlie Parker. I feel that's true. I'm not sure, but they must have been forerunners there. They certainly were stepping outside the bounds that had been set by virtually all jazz players up to that time.
And were most of the musicians aware of that at that time, like 1940, 41? I mean, I'm just always interested, like when I talk about Lester Young, whether he was just considered another good tenor player at that moment, or whether it was realized that he was something special.
No. The way you could tell was what records did the musicians buy. And we bought, after all, in a very discriminating fashion. We bought not tunes or not even bands. We bought records where Les Young had his 8 bars or 16 bar solo. So the answer would be, oh yes, the musicians were very aware, because they would bypass 100 kinds of things, pay no attention to it as just another good player or something, but not Lester Young or Christian or Eldridge or Blanton. Right. That was always the safest way to find out what counts with the musicians themselves. And those are the recordings that we would buy, and we'd travel on the road with them and play them after the job. Usually.
Can you remember any in particular by those artists, or is that?
I think I could probably almost sing the one that Les Young. That I shall never. It might have been 1 O'Clock Jump, the Bassies. His solo on that record, that was. Where I think he introduced sort of false fingering.
Oh, sure.
And things. Again, with that one pork pie hat and that wonderful, sideways slant on the instrument. That I do recall. There was a recording with Duke and Blanton.
Pitter Patter Panther?
Probably, yes.
One of those.
Knockout. That actually, Peggy Lee and others we'd have the records, and after a job in Worcester, Massachusetts, or Sandusky, Ohio, we'd sit down with a little portable phonograph and listen to this. We were very faithful, very knowledgeable that these were important people.
Among some other important people that were kind of in the vanguard at that moment, let's talk about drummers. You already talked about Big Sid Catlett. You could say, in a sense, that the work of Big Sid and Joe Jones and Kenny Clark at that point were really the perfect players to accompany Lester and Blanton and people like that, because they really seemed to be breaking it up. And how were you aware of the change of the role of the drummer, going from Manzi Johnson and Zooey Singleton and Chick Webb and Krupa to Big Sid, to Joe Jones, and even to Kenny Clark? And I can ask you, when we mentioned Kenny Clark, if you ever had occasion to go to Minton's or to Monroe's where those sessions were held.
Yes, I did. But you must remember that I then was drafted into the Army right about that key time, probably very shortly after accompanying Charlie Christian down to the draft board. I myself went into the Army, and then soon enough was off to Europe, where there was no contact whatsoever with what was going on. But yes, I'd been up to Minton's, and I knew nothing whatsoever about the great shift that did take place. My feeling about Joe Jones and Kenny Clark and Big Sid, whom I knew very well, of course I knew Joe as well, and Kenny, my feeling was that they were becoming far more musical than the older drummers had been, in that they had seemed to have better ears for what the other players were playing, and as a consequence, now this is interesting because it's paradoxical, as a consequence, some of the younger disciples, whom then I later realized were playing it in a new way, began to play more. They were no longer accessories, let's put it that way. They weren't just pumping the beat for you, the star, to play over, as it were. They were wonderful, of course, but they were taking hold, maybe a little bit in an updated way, the way I was doing on String of Pearls, where the others were playing, but I was very busy. They were becoming busy, which ironically was not comfortably suited to my style or to Benny's. You see, that's the irony.
Yes.
We needed to have all the space and all the room given to us,
right,
as it were, and they weren't doing that, which gave rise probably to the shift in style of even the way rhythm sections would play, the way pianists would play, and so on. But I missed all that early development, and not until I got back from Europe after World War II did, and by the way, immediately when I got back, I still remember, I think, being met, walking down down the gangplank, I remember being met by Leonard Feather. And Leonard said I must tell him what's going on. By this time I had begun to drift toward the world in which I've been living for the last 30 years or so. He wanted to know what was going on in the world of serious music, new music in Europe, the avant-garde, and so on. And he'd swap, and he would take me around and let me know what was going on in the old world that I had left, the world of jazz. And I recall, I think I was not here 2 days back after, it must have been end of 1945 or beginning of 46, when he took me to a little club to hear what was, he said, this is the thing. This is what's happening. The guys playing were, and I'm certain of 2 or 3. I'm certain Max Roach was playing the drums, Dizzy was playing the trumpet, Charlie Parker was playing the alto. I'm not sure, it might have been Thelonious Monk playing the piano, possibly Bud Powell, I'm not sure. It was a little club, it wasn't Jimmy Ryan's, but it was that kind of thing right there, 52nd. You probably would know, maybe, of course it was not Birdland, that was something else.
The Three Deuces.
That sounds like it, yes. And I remember sitting there absolutely stunned at what I heard.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunned. It must have been the birth of Bob playing. Now, I have to tell you, I have to go on record telling you, I thought it was so marvelous. I had no personal contact with it or anything like that. It was not music that I could play.
Right.
But I thought it was marvelous. Now, many of my colleagues, I seem to recall, didn't think that, or they were angered by it, or something.
Sure.
Or they felt challenged by it, or something. But I, possibly because I had begun to live in another area of music, maybe I was spared those feelings. I simply was, I was so dazzled. I didn't know what they were doing. I hadn't the foggiest notion. And I guess in a way I was glad that my period of jazz was history. I would hate to have to figure out all that stuff that they were playing, but I thought it was absolutely marvelous. I had heard, by the way, Dizzy just before I went to Europe. Earl Hines brought his band to New Haven, where I was stationed in the Army.
Right.
And they played at the Schubert Theater there. And I went backstage to see Earl, who used to use the Earl as his theme song, you see. So I went back, hugged him, and I heard, I think, Sweet George Brown or something. I heard this trumpet player stand up and play. And I spoke to him at that time, and I said, what are you doing? That is the most phenomenal trumpet playing I'd ever heard. That was Dizzy. That was my first hearing of him when he was playing in Earl Hines' band.
Before we jump into the post-World War II period, we covered drummers, we talked about horn players, we talked about pianists and guitarists. Just to complete that line of questioning about bass players, you had the chance in Benny's band to play with first, I believe John Simmons was there for a little while.
Yes.
Who was really ahead of his time, and then someone named Mort Stolmaker came in, and then Sid Weiss was there for quite a bit.
Wasn't there also Duvivier George?
That was later.
That was later.
Yeah. But this is before you went in the Army. Do you have any recollections of John Simmons? Because I've always felt that he was a little more modern. His notes were a little bit longer and a little bit more legato than some of the Walter Page and
yes,
and people like that, and John Kirby. And how did you see a development in bass playing with some of those great players, John Kirby, Walter Page? And,
well, here I suppose the selfishness of the two-handed piano player comes into the picture. I tended to be a little oblivious to bassists because when I improvised, I wanted quite complete freedom, and I didn't want to have to clash. So, in a funny sense, I would admire them impersonally, as it were.
Right.
But I would love to play with bassists who I didn't know were there. You see.
Sure.
And I always felt that pianists like Tatum, Teddy, myself, were really pains in the neck to the bassists because we covered their area with our left hands. And at most, I mean, we weren't going to listen to them, so they'd have to listen to us. At most, they would have to try to stay out of the way. So I'm the last guy in the world to make comments about bassists. I don't know if I made that clear. I admired them very much, and I was aware of the imposition that I burdened them with.
Yes.
But at the same time, it'd be very difficult for me to judge one from the other.
Sure.
I was only, whenever I became aware of a bassist, that it was a bassist I'd prefer not to play with.
Right. All right. You mentioned that you left Benny's band in the early part of I think it was the summer of 1942, right? It was right after the band made Mission to Moscow.
Yes.
And right before they went to Hollywood to make a movie. By the way, your place was taken by, I think it was Jimmy Rolls.
Oh, yes.
Joined the band after you left. I wonder if you could just summarize what happened during your Army career and how you wound up playing with the Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band.
Well, the Army career was it's not one of my happier memories. There may have been people who enjoyed World War II. I did not. I was drafted. I recall that at the time, I guess it was 1942, yes, shortly after Pearl Harbor. I think that my most magisterial aspiration was to survive the war, to return with all limbs, if possible. And it was a time, young fellows like yourself will not, of course, recall any of this history. There was a time when Hitler's armies, in coordination with his major ally Japan, Italy was there also, but was not terribly significant in the military sense. His armies really were all over Europe. I'm not certain now, I'm not a World War II historian, but probably by that time, I remember the New York Times and other papers would show maps, and of course the black was covered, all this dark area was covered by Hitler, and the white, Vestal Virgin Purity was the Allies, and there was very little white on the maps. I think by that time probably Scandinavia had fallen. France had already fallen in 6 weeks, I guess, in 1940. The possibility of invasion of Great Britain was was imminent. And I must say, even though it sounds absurd now, at that time, I believed that it would be 30 or 40, knowing a little European history, it'd be another 30-year war, perhaps a 100-year war. It looked there would be no end to this because look at all the horror that had to be undone, as it were. So it was without outlook that I went into the Army and went through the basic training and so on. I must say, did not have a particularly good time of it, because the night before I had been given a send-off party by, I still have a picture taken at the piano by Duke Ellington and Count Basie, Teddy Wilson, and Hazel Scott. Mine was the one sort of honky face in the midst of this, and they made a party for me at Cafe Society to say ciao and adieu and good luck and so on. From there to Fort Dix was a fairly radical decline, let's say.
Probably worried about your hands. You didn't know
I
how to
was
hurt
worried
your hands.
about everything, yes.
Everything.
And I was not a crack marksman or anything, so getting up at 4:30 in the morning and shooting at targets and so on did not seem. In any case, the going away party at Cafe Society did not equip me psychologically for the next morning, or for the many next mornings. And then Glenn Miller reached down into the Atlantic City. That's where we were doing our basic training, into the Atlantic City shooting ranges, and I was informed that I was going to be assigned to the Army Air Force, to Glenn Miller, who was then organizing that what subsequently became a famous Air Force band. And I scooted away from the target practice very happily, I must say, and joined that band, which I found many of my old friends. And we spent the war not quite, as Joey Bushkin said, his experience in the war, he said he spent it in the Silver Foxhole. Well, it wasn't quite that, because we did a lot of traveling in Europe and war zones and so on and so forth. But the next few years until 1945 were basically a great deal of performing different kinds of combinations, because Miller had brought together many of the very finest string players from the different symphonic orchestras in the country. we had some of the concert masters and so on. We had David Schwartz, great violist with the Roginski and Cleveland Orchestra, plus Zeke Zarchi and Ray McKinley and
Bernie Priven.
And Bernie Priven, of course, and Johnny Desmond, the singer, and
Right.
Tony Martin also was there. And others, pianists, I think there were 3 or 4. Lou Stein was there, and a pianist named Arnold Moss.
Ross.
Arnold Ross, yes, was one of the other pianists. I remember and some good arrangers of music. Norman Layden was one, and Ralph Wilkinson. Some of those names come back, but many. Hank Freeman, a saxophone player.
Yes, from Artie Shaw's band.
Marty Shaw's band was there. So it was, and of course Glad himself was expert, and we spent the time working very hard, actually. Those rehearsal hours now would be very expensive, I imagine. We sometimes it'd be 6 hours of rehearsing. Which imagine doing that now with, say, 60 or 70 people.
Sure.
Around, and copyists, and Jerry Gray was there. I think he was the composer of String of Pearls.
And what was your function as a composer, arranger, and pianist?
Composer, arranger, and pianist, yes. And I was given a little band to lead. It was called Uptown Hall in London. That was Ray McKinley and Peanuts Hucko, by the way, and myself, and perhaps 1 or 2 other players I can't think of. So I would have the little band, and I would play in the big band. I would compose for the large band. I would compose for the entire the big thing with the string section and so on, and then for the jazz band. From these 60 or 70 people, Glenn would make a great diversity of combinations.
Was the writing all in the jazz vein, or did you have the opportunity to write for strings, and did you go into the classical field a little bit?
I wrote a lot for the strings, and then I wrote some quasi-serious chamber music, which we never performed, but just if there was an afternoon free, the players would be delighted to play some of this for woodwind quintets or string quartets or something of that sort.
Do you still have those works? I mean, do you have the scores?
No, I must say they have been honorably buried somewhere, perhaps in Europe.
We'd like to play a recording. I couldn't, unfortunately, put my fingers on any of the recordings you made with the Army Air Force Band, although there is an LP out in Europe that says featuring Mel Powell with the Army Air Force Band. But we do have one that I believe was made in Paris right before you returned tonight. This is called If Dreams Come True, featuring Django Reinhardt on the guitar. we heard recorded in Paris with Django Reinhardt, If Dreams Come True, at the beginning of that set of music. And wondering, Mel, I realize we've taken a lot of your time so far, and we don't have that much time left, so we'll have to kind of capsulize the rest of your career. But how did you wind up playing with Django, and do you have any memories of him or thoughts about him in 1983?
Oh yes, very, very warm memories. Django, of course, found us out, that is myself and I think pianist Hucko and McKinley. Imagine being in France, having experienced the Germanic occupation and so on, and loving and honoring jazz as Django and his famous partner, Stephen Grappelli, the violinist, did, and being absolutely starved, having no opportunity. So Django became the most charming and endearing host you can imagine. He took me everywhere to Paris. I can't even remember the places, but Django was a gypsy, you see, and he really brought me into a gypsy community, and we'd go to places that, for all I know, they still may exist, but no one knows about them. It's a marvelous memory, and playing with him, I didn't even recall that was recorded, although I'm glad it is, because you see how beautifully he played, and how very distinct. Played almost somewhat like sometimes classical guitarist, with elegant vibrato and little glides of intonation, and the notes, very interesting pitches he would pick. Yeah. He was a wonderful man, full of life, probably the most exuberant guy I've ever known.
Yeah. It was amazing how the scenery changed after that first chorus, where you kind of played the melody block chord style. And it's interesting, you hadn't been back to the States, and you obviously, as you mentioned before, hadn't heard the new sounds of jazz, how things were to change. But yet, just playing the melody on the piano like that, block chord style like that, with all that space, and with just the bass doing a very leisurely two-beat, yes. Was kind of ESP or something, because that's
ESP, yes.
So what was going on If Dreams Come True back in the States. You left the Army, and as you mentioned, you did enjoy World War II, and I certainly can understand why, and I'm sure you were happy to get out. And what happened besides hearing Charlie Parker and getting into those sounds? Did you go back with Benny as soon as you came back? Or was there an interim period where you just cooled your jets, so to speak?
I think that probably the first work I did was with, I think Andre Previn called me to go to Los Angeles for a while, mm-hmm. and join him. The two of us were the staff pianists for MGM for a while. I think I was beginning to have to sit down, as it were, in one given place for some length of time. Composing what is called serious music was then becoming a more important part of my life, demanding more time, and requiring the sort of professional commitment to a place where one could work rather than being on the road and or being on call. So I think that happened first of all, and then I'm not sure whether. Well, you would probably know better than I am. I'm not sure whether I ever really rejoined Benny. I think we played by this time. Well, of course, Benny never did want to rehearse anymore by this time, so he would call me wherever he was, wherever I was. I think he'd either call Teddy Wilson or myself so that he wouldn't have to rehearse, because we knew the tunes and loved to play together and so on. So I'm sure there were plenty of occasions when I played with him, but I don't recall whether I ever actually returned to the band or not.
I think you did. I mean, that recording of My Guys Come Back, and those records you made with Red Norvo, with Shine and Tiger Rag. I believe that there was a little period in late 1945 when you were actually in the band, and you went to California after that. I believe
that's probably true.
It's kind of funny to be in the position of telling someone what they did. I hope you'll forgive me, but that's what I do. I noticed a change, in listening to those records and listening to those small band records with Red Norvo. We didn't hear them today. It was a subtle change, not so much in the sound of the music. I mean, it was still Mel Powell and still Benny Goodman, but it was a change down deep. Possibly, were you feeling you weren't in the avant-garde in the sense of when you left in 1942, 41, you were doing new things. This was,
yes,
the new edge. And when you came back, as you mentioned, you felt that you didn't even want to deal with, in a sense, the bebop movement and all those kind of things. So was that part of the reason that you eventually found a home in classical music and went to Yale and studied with Hindemith and then taught there and all those things? Was it because down deep you didn't feel the same burning desire to
as far as I can remember, and remember we're talking over a period maybe of 4 decades or something like that. It's quite a batch of years,
yes.
Nearly half a century. So my recollection can be somewhat distorted. But my memory of it, Lauren, is that I think I did become tired of the music. As I had mentioned earlier, I found what the then new players, Dizzy, Gillespie, and Charlie Parker, what they were doing seemed absolutely marvelous. And I think they were burning with the kind of intensity and heat that I must have had in 1939, 1940, right. Something of that sort, which I really no longer did have. And I suppose it was some sort of interior rearrangement, but I was drifting further and further away from an interest in what remained a performer's art. Mm-hmm. And I was moving more to composition and in an area of composition which really, I guess, cannot be called jazz. It was taking more and more of my attention. Probably, now when I heard a few things here, some little things that I would sketch out at the record date for the performers to play when I was playing with them, probably there were some almost unconscious overlaps coming in.
Yes.
I think a little bit of that of the Get Happy that you just played, and the introduction to that, and that kind of rhythmic distribution and so on. It was probably a watering down from some Stravinsky score or something I must have just been looking at.
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose that was what was taking place. Incidentally, thank you for playing "You're My Thrill," which just knocked me out.
Yes.
It's not the most polite or most modest thing to say, but that was an extraordinary record,
it is,
wasn't it?
It is, and one thing that impresses me about it is there were several jazz pianists, or a couple that I can think of, who really made quite a deal out of borrowing from different eras of classical music. One might take more romantic things into jazz from the classical repertoire, and another one, a few I can think of, who took Mozartian and motifs and things like that and tried and jazz them up. Whereas what you did on "You're My Thrill" there seemed to me very natural, and like you said, it was subconsciously the study with Hindemith and the exposure to all that music was just coming out naturally, whereas I feel many other jazz musicians were doing this consciously, and it sounded contrived. It sounded very natural, and I think that's, if I might say, part of the frustration one feels when Mel Powell stopped playing jazz piano in the mid 1950s. But of course, that's what you had to do. And
it's sweet and flattering to hear, Lauren. Thank you.
Well, it's something that I'm sure many people feel, because you really were doing something new there, and there was quite a change in that work that you did for Vanguard in the mid 1950s from anything you had done before. Those pretty much were the last jazz recordings you made, except for occasional reunions with Benny Goodman. Through you worked at the Waldorf Astoria, even I think for a moment or two,
probably,
in 1957, and you had written the music for a soundtrack, Change of Mind, or something about mental. But something with mental problems or something like
there was
that.
a documentary.
A documentary with string
score,
chord.
for the, I think it was either the New Music Quartet or the Juilliard Quartet.
Yes.
Broder Searle was playing, and Benny.
Benny was on it.
He was Benny. Every now and then I would hire Benny, trying to get even, but of course I never did. Well, I'd always pay him scale.
Maybe Benny was actually subconsciously an early role model, because of course Benny was someone who made forays into the classical world, of course not to the depth or involvement that you have, but still in that day and age, 1938, 1940, his recordings, especially some of his early recordings of the Debussy,
the Rhapsody.
The Rhapsody, is still in the classical world stands up as a definitive
Lovely performance, yes.
recording of that. Did you talk with Benny in those days about classical music?
Oh, occasionally we would even go further than that. We'd occasionally play some, not a concert, but privately we'd play some, perhaps the Brahms together. But no, we never did. Actually, we're going in different directions, because I think Benny's, well, it's the old problem of the difference of the performer and the composer. I think Benny's pursuits were of the standard literature for the clarinet. Which is, of course, limited to a handful of works, at least two of which, I'm thinking of the Mozart Quintet and Mozart Concerto, are, of course, masterpieces of literature. Whereas my work in composition was, of course, had to do with where we are in the 20th century.
No.
It was far different. So there wasn't a great deal we had in common. And as you know, when you speak of so-called classical music, there are publics and publics. There are those who collect the Renata Tebaldi records or something of that sort. They don't know of anything. They've never heard. They've never been to a chamber music concert. They're opera buffs and so on. They will tell you everyone said every performance of Aida and whatnot. So even though the blanket characterization classical music would apply, still I think the interests were very, very different.
After you left the performance world, and I assume that when you stopped playing jazz was when the Mel Powell, the pianist, went to the didn't play anymore. Wonder if you could just tell us what you've been involved in recently. Of course, you've been teaching, composing, and have disciples and many friends all around the world. And just wonder if you could tell us some highlights of your recent years, things that have meant a lot to you.
Well, the so-called serious composer, I keep saying so-called serious composer, largely because as an old jazz piano player, I felt that jazz players, above all, are very, very serious musicians, and so I'm tempted not to. I don't particularly like the expression classical music. I prefer to have that refer to a particular period, the classic period as opposed to the romantic period and so on. But in any case, the composer of so-called serious music is, in this country and in most others, is not yielding, say, a negotiable produce, and so he or she will very often, unless he or she is independently wealthy, very often will pursue the profession, the academic world, which is what I have done since probably the late 50s, actually. Yes, my goodness, that's a long time there.
That's when I was born.
That's when you were born. My academic career being mainly divided between Yale, where I I succeeded my teacher, who was Paul Hindemith, and became chairman of the composition faculty there. I stayed at Yale, I suppose, about 15 years. And then I was invited to found a school out at the California Institute of the Arts, at CalArts, and I accepted that invitation. And since that time, I've been there. Although I happily, in the mid-70s, was able to unlimber myself and get rid of the administrative tasks, so I'm no longer doing any of that. As far as the musical life itself is concerned, it's divided between the teaching chores, which I and many others actually take great pleasure in, as strange as that may sound, especially after 30 years of doing it, teaching the graduate students at CalArts, and composition. Now, of course, I'm here in New York because of the New York premiere of recent work, string quartet. I don't know when you will run this, but I mean, so it might be obsolete, but the premiere is to take place tomorrow night.
October 21st.
21st, Friday night at the Metropolitan Museum, the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium. That is the most recent work, although